Two poor boys from a tiny village became billionaires and returned home after 10 years. But what they discovered about their teacher will make you cry. This is their true story. But to understand how far they traveled, you need to see where it all began. In the dusty village of Quamcrum, where the harmattan wind carries dreams across endless fields of millet and corn, lived two boys who dared to believe in something bigger than their reality. Their names were James and John, and they were best friends since the day they could walk. James was 12, with bright eyes that sparkled with curiosity about everything around him. John was 11, quieter than his friend, but with a mind that could solve problems like magic. But their lives were harder than most children should ever know. James lived with his grandmother Hannah in a small mud house with walls so thin you could hear every raindrop during the wet season. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 7, leaving Hannah to care for him with the little money she made selling kenki at the village market. Some days, they ate only once. Some days, not at all. John's story was just as heartbreaking. His father, Mike, had injured his back working construction in the city and could no longer work. His mother, Janet, washed clothes for other families, scrubbing until her hands bled. But the money was never enough to feed their family of 6 children. John was the second oldest, and he knew that every coin his mother earned had to stretch like magic to keep him alive. Despite their poverty, both boys shared one impossible dream. They wanted to go to school. Every morning, they would watch from a distance as other children walked past their homes wearing clean uniforms, carrying books and lunch boxes, heading to the village school. James and John would follow them secretly, hiding behind trees and walls, watching through the windows as teachers wrote magical symbols on blackboards and children raised their hands to answer questions. One day, James would whisper to John, "We'll sit in those chairs too." One day, John would whisper back, "We'll learn to read those big books." But that day seemed impossible. School fees, uniforms, books, pencils, everything cost money they didn't have. Their families needed every pair of hands working, not sitting in classrooms dreaming. The village school had one teacher who was different from all the others. His name was Mr. Joseph Mensah, and he had been teaching in Quamcrum for 15 years. While other teachers came from the city and left after a few months, complaining about the poor conditions, Mr. Joseph stayed. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that were held together with tape. His clothes were always clean but clearly old, patched in places where they had worn thin. He lived in 2 small rooms behind the school, and everyone knew he sent most of his small salary to support his own aging parents in another village. But what made Mr. Joseph special wasn't what he had. It was what he saw in others. Every afternoon, when school ended and the fee-paying students went home, Mr. Joseph would notice 2 small figures lingering near the school compound. He watched as James and John would pick up discarded papers from the ground, trying to copy the letters and numbers they had seen through the windows. One Thursday evening, as the sun painted the sky orange and red, Mr. Joseph was walking home when he heard voices coming from behind the old mango tree near the school. He moved quietly closer and saw something that made his heart skip a beat. James and John were sitting on the ground, using a stick to draw letters in the dust. James was teaching John what he had memorized from watching through the classroom window. "This one is, James whispered, carefully drawing the letter. "And this one is B. The teacher said they make sounds." "Show me how to write my name," John whispered back excitedly. I don't know all the letters yet," James admitted sadly. "But maybe tomorrow we can watch again and learn more." Mr. Joseph felt tears forming in his eyes. Here were 2 boys so hungry for knowledge that they were creating their own school under a tree, with sticks and dust as their tools. That night, Mr. Joseph couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about James and John, about their determination, about the intelligence he could see shining in their eyes even from a distance. He thought about all the students in his classroom whose parents paid for their education, but who didn't seem to value it. And he thought about these 2 boys who had nothing but wanted to learn more than anything in the world. The next morning, Mr. Joseph made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going straight to his classroom, he walked to the mango tree where he had seen the boys the night before. Sure enough, James and John were there, practicing their letters in the dust. When they saw the teacher approaching, both boys jumped up in fear, thinking they were in trouble for being on school property. "Please, sir, we're sorry," James said quickly, backing away. "We weren't doing anything wrong. We'll leave right now," John added, his voice shaking. But Mr. Joseph smiled gently and sat down under the tree. "Don't leave," he said softly. "Show me what you've been learning." The boys looked at each other in confusion. Was this a trick? Were they about to be punished? "Come," Mr. Joseph said, patting the ground beside him. "I want to see your letters." Slowly, carefully, James knelt down and began drawing the dust with his stick. His hand was shaking, but he managed to write several letters he had memorized. Mr. Joseph watched in amazement. The letters were shaky but recognizable. More importantly, he could see that James understood what he was doing. This wasn't just copying, this was learning. "Very good," Mr. Joseph said warmly. "Now, John, show me what you know." John was even more nervous, but he managed to write a few letters too. His were smaller and more careful than James's, showing a different kind of intelligence, methodical and precise. "Boys," Mr. Joseph said quietly, "how long have you been teaching yourselves?" About 3 months, sir," James admitted. "We watch through the windows and try to remember what we see." "And what do you want to do with this learning?" The boys exchanged glances. Finally, John spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We want to help our families, sir. We want to be able to read and write, so we can find good work someday, so our families won't be hungry anymore." Mr. Joseph felt his heart breaking and healing at the same time. These boys, with their torn clothes and empty stomachs, had dreams bigger than many of his regular students. "What if I told you," Mr. Joseph said slowly, "that there might be a way for you to not just learn to read and write, but to get the best education possible? What if I told you there was a way to make your dreams come true?" James and John stared at him with wide eyes, not daring to believe what they were hearing. "Sir," James whispered. Mr. Joseph continued, "what if there was a way for you to study not just here in our village school, but in a big university in another country? What if you could become doctors or engineers or businessmen?" The boys' mouths fell open. Such things seemed as impossible as touching the moon. "But, sir," John said sadly, "we have no money. Our families, they need us to work, not to study." Mr. Joseph looked at both boys for a long moment. He thought about his own small savings, carefully put away over years of teaching. He thought about the scholarship programs he had read about in the newspapers, programs that sent bright African students to study abroad. He thought about his own comfortable but simple life, and how he could make it even simpler if it meant giving these boys a chance. "Boys," he said finally, "what if money wasn't a problem? What if someone believed in you enough to help make it happen?" "Someone like who?" James asked, his voice full of hope and disbelief. Mr. Joseph smiled and adjusted his taped glasses. "Someone like me." The words hung in the air like magic. James and John couldn't speak. They couldn't move. They couldn't even breathe properly. "Sir," John finally managed to whisper, "what do you mean?" "I mean that I see something special in both of you. I see intelligence, determination, and most importantly, I see hearts that want to use education to help others. If you're willing to work harder than you've ever worked before, if you're willing to study day and night, if you're willing to leave everything familiar behind to chase this dream, then I'm willing to help you get there." James felt tears streaming down his face. John was shaking so hard he could barely sit still. "But, sir," James said through his tears, "why would you do this for us? We're nobody. We have nothing to give you back." Mr. Joseph stood up and brushed the dust off his pants. He looked at both boys with such kindness that they felt warm all over despite their confusion. "You're wrong about being nobody," he said gently. "You're exactly the kind of somebody this world needs more of. And as for giving me something back," he paused and smiled, "someday, when you've achieved your dreams, you'll understand what you can give back. But for now, just promise me you'll work harder than you ever thought possible." Both boys nodded so vigorously their necks hurt. "Good," Mr. Joseph said. "Meet me here tomorrow at sunrise. Your real education begins then. And boys, yes, sir, they said together, this journey won't be easy. There will be times when you'll want to give up, times when you'll feel scared and alone. But I want you to remember this moment under this tree when someone believed in you enough to change your entire life. Can you promise me you'll remember? We promise, sir, they whispered. As Mr. Joseph walked away, James and John sat in stunned silence. Had this really happened? Had their impossible dream just become possible? They didn't know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would take them farther than they ever imagined. They didn't know about the challenges, the homesickness, the moments of doubt that lay ahead. And they certainly didn't know that 10 years later, they would return to the same village as millionaires, only to discover something about Mr. Joseph that would change their hearts forever. What Mr. Joseph did next will make you cry. He sold everything he owned, including his late father's wedding ring, just to send 2 poor boys to study abroad. But the boys' journey was harder than anyone imagined. For the next 3 months, James and John met Mr. Joseph every morning at sunrise under the mango tree. What they learned during those sessions changed them forever. Mr. Joseph didn't just teach them letters and numbers. He taught them English, the language they would need to survive abroad. He taught them about the world beyond their village, showing them pictures in old magazines he had collected over the years. He taught them table manners, how to shake hands properly, how to speak with confidence. But most importantly, he taught them to believe in themselves. In 3 months, Mr. Joseph told them one morning, you'll take a test. If you pass, you'll win scholarships to study at the International Academy in London. But boys, I need to tell you something important. James and John sat up straighter, sensing the seriousness in their teacher's voice. The scholarships will only cover your school fees and accommodation. They won't cover your flights, your food, your books, or your other needs. That money I will provide. But, sir, John whispered, where will you get so much money? Mr. Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn gold ring. This was my father's wedding ring, he said softly. It's the only valuable thing I own. I've also been saving money for 15 years to build my own house someday. That dream can wait. Your dreams cannot. James felt his throat close up with emotion. Sir, we can't let you do this. You can't stop me, Mr. Joseph replied with a gentle smile. This is my choice. This is what I want to do with my life. Help 2 brilliant boys become the men they're meant to be. Over the following weeks, James and John watched as their teacher sold everything valuable he owned. His small radio, his bicycle, his father's ring, even his extra clothes. He kept only what he absolutely needed to survive. When the boys protested, Mr. Joseph would say the same thing. The greatest investment a teacher can make is in his students' futures. The scholarship test day arrived like a storm. James and John had never been so nervous in their lives. They sat in the district education office, surrounded by students from wealthy families who had been preparing for this test their entire lives. When the results came 2 weeks later, Mr. Joseph was waiting at the mango tree with the biggest smile the boys had ever seen. You did it, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. You both won full scholarships. James and John couldn't speak. They just held each other and cried. But their joy was mixed with terror. In 1 month, they would leave the city, their families, their culture, their language, everything they had ever known, to study in London, a city they had only seen in Mr. Joseph's old magazines. The day of departure was the hardest day of their young lives. At the airport in Accra, James said goodbye to his grandmother Hannah, who held him so tight he thought she might never let go. Be good, my grandson, she whispered through her tears. Make us proud, but don't forget where you come from. John's entire family came to see him off, his parents, his 5 siblings, all of them crying. His mother, Janet, pressed a small wooden cross into his hand. When you feel alone, she said, hold this and remember that we love you. Mr. Joseph was there too, of course. He had used the last of his money to buy the boys plane tickets and to give them each a small suitcase with basic necessities. Remember, he told them as they prepared to board the plane, you're not just carrying your own dreams. You're carrying the dreams of everyone who believes in you. Study hard, work harder, and someday come back and help others the way I'm helping you. As their plane lifted off from the city, James and John pressed their faces to the small window and watched their country disappear below the clouds. They held hands and cried, wondering if they would ever see home again. London hit them like a cold slap in the face. The International Academy was beautiful, with tall stone buildings, manicured lawns, and students who looked like they had never known a day of hunger in their lives. James and John arrived with their small suitcases and worn clothes, looking completely out of place among classmates who carried designer bags and wore expensive shoes. Their dormitory room was small but clean, with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a window that looked out over the busy London streets. It was the nicest place either boy had ever slept, but it felt like a prison because it was so far from home. The first weeks were brutal. The classes were taught entirely in English, but the English they heard was nothing like what Mr. Joseph had taught them. The teacher spoke quickly, using words they had never heard before. The textbooks were huge and heavy, filled with concepts that seemed impossible to understand. Worse than the academic challenges were the social ones. Other students looked at them strangely. Some laughed at their accents. Others avoided them completely. At lunch, James and John would sit alone at a corner table, missing the simple food from home and wondering if they had made a terrible mistake. "Maybe we should go back," John whispered to James one night as they lay in their beds, homesick and exhausted. "We can't," James replied, though his voice was shaking. "Mr. Joseph gave up everything for us. We can't let him down." Their breakthrough came during their 3rd month at the academy. James was struggling with a mathematics problem late one night when he remembered something Mr. Joseph had told him under the mango tree. When the work gets hard, that's when you discover who you really are. Instead of giving up, James decided to work even harder. He stayed up until midnight every night, reviewing his notes, practicing his English, asking teachers for extra help even when other students mocked him for it. John did the same with his science classes. While other students complained about homework, John saw each assignment as a step closer to honoring Mr. Joseph's sacrifice. Slowly, things began to change. Their English improved dramatically. Their grades started climbing. Teachers began to notice their dedication and started offering extra support. Most importantly, they began to believe in themselves again. By the end of their first year, both boys were in the top 10% of their class. By their second year, they were student leaders. By their third year, they were the top students in the entire academy. During their final year at the academy, James discovered he had a gift for understanding business and finance. He spent hours reading about successful entrepreneurs, studying how businesses worked, dreaming about creating companies that could employ thousands of people. John's passion was technology. He taught himself computer programming, staying up until dawn writing code, creating apps and software programs that amazed his teachers. After graduation, both boys earned full scholarships to Oxford University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. At Oxford, their talents truly flourished. James started his first business while still a student, a small company that helped African students find housing in London. Within 2 years, he had expanded it into a full international education consultancy that served students from 50 countries. John created a revolutionary app that helped people in developing countries access banking services through their mobile phones. Tech companies from around the world wanted to buy his technology, but success brought new challenges. As their businesses grew and their bank accounts filled with money they had never dreamed possible, James and John began to worry about losing touch with their roots. They lived in expensive apartments, wore designer suits, and attended fancy business meetings. But late at night, they would call each other and talk about home. "Do you think Mr. Joseph is proud of us?" John would ask. "Do you think we're becoming the kind of people we used to admire or the kind we used to fear?" James would wonder. They tried to stay connected to the city, sending money home to their families every month and calling when they could. But international calls were expensive, and they were both working 18-hour days building their companies. Years passed in a blur of meetings, contracts, and success. By their 8th year in London, James's education company was worth over £50 million. John's technology company had been valued at over £100 million. By their 10th year abroad, Both boys had become legitimate billionaires. But something was missing as their success grew. So did their fear, the fear that they were losing the most important thing of all, their connection to the man who had made it all possible. They tried calling Mr. Joseph, but the village phone lines were unreliable. They sent letters, but responses took months to arrive. And when they did, they seemed shorter and more formal than before. What if he thinks we've forgotten him? James worried during one of their late-night phone calls. What if he's disappointed in who we become? John replied, what if... James's voice broke. What if something has happened to him, and we don't even know? That fear kept them awake at night. They had achieved everything they had dreamed of and more. They had money, success, respect, and power. But without Mr. Joseph to share it with, without his approval and his smile, it all felt hollow. As their 10th year abroad came to an end, both James and John made the same decision independently. It was time to go home. It was time to thank the man who had changed their lives. It was time to repay the teacher whose sacrifice had made them who they were. They had no idea that what they would find when they returned to Quamcrum would break their hearts and change their understanding of success forever. When the two billionaires returned to thank their teacher after 10 years, what they found in his empty house will make you cry. The truth about his sacrifice was more heartbreaking than anyone could imagine. This is the moment that changed everything they thought they knew about success. December 15th, 2034. After 10 long years abroad, James and John were finally coming home to the city. But they weren't returning as the poor, hungry boys who had left. They came back as two of the youngest billionaires in Africa, riding in a convoy of expensive cars that kicked up clouds of red dust as they drove through the familiar villages of their childhood. James, now 22, wore a perfectly tailored suit and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built a business empire. His education company now operated in 30 countries, helping thousands of African students study abroad every year. John, now 21, looked equally successful in his designer clothes and expensive watch. His technology company had revolutionized mobile banking across Africa, and tech magazines around the world featured his face on their covers. But despite all their success, despite all their wealth, their hearts were beating fast with nervousness as their cars approached Quamcrum. They hadn't been able to reach Mr. Joseph in months. His phone had been disconnected, and their letters had gone unanswered. What if he doesn't recognize us? James wondered aloud as they passed the familiar mango trees and mud houses of their childhood. What if he's angry that we stayed away so long? John replied, adjusting his tie nervously. They had planned this moment for months. In the trunk of their car was a briefcase containing $5 million in cash. Money they wanted to give to Mr. Joseph to repay him for everything he had done. They had also drawn up plans to build him a beautiful house, to start a foundation in his name, to make sure he never wanted for anything again. As their convoy pulled into the village center, people came running from all directions. Children who had never seen such expensive cars before stared with wide eyes. Adults whispered excitedly, try to figure out who these important visitors could be. Then, slowly, recognition dawned on some of the older villagers' faces. James? James Kwame? Called out an elderly woman, squinting in disbelief. John? Little John Asani? Gasped a man who had known John's family. Within minutes, word spread throughout the village like wildfire. The two poor boys who had left 10 years ago had returned as rich men. James and John climbed out of their cars, smiling broadly at the crowds of villagers who had gathered to welcome them home. They shook hands, hugged old neighbors, and distributed gifts they had brought from London, toys for the children, clothes for the adults, medicine for the elderly. But their eyes kept searching the crowd for one face, the face of the man who had made it all possible. Where is Mr. Joseph? James finally asked Hannah, his grandmother, who was crying with joy at seeing him again. Hannah's face suddenly changed. The smile disappeared, replaced by something that made James's stomach drop. You don't know? Hannah whispered. Know what? John asked, stepping closer, his voice filled with worry. Hannah looked around at the other villagers, and James and John saw the same strange expression on everyone's faces, a mixture of sadness, pity, and something else they couldn't identify. Boys, Hannah said gently, taking James's hand in her weathered fingers. "Sit down. There's something we need to tell you." "Where's Mr. Joseph?" John demanded, his voice rising with panic. "What happened to our teacher?" An old man named Peter, who had been the village chief for many years, stepped forward. His face was grave, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a truth that would change everything. "Boys," Chief Peter said slowly, "Mr. Joseph, he died 3 years ago." The words hit James and John like a physical blow. The sounds of the celebrating village faded to nothing. The world seemed to stop spinning. "No," James whispered. "No, that's not possible. We were going to thank him. We were going to repay him. We were going to—" "How?" John's voice was barely audible. "How did he die?" Chief Peter looked at the other villagers, as if asking permission to continue. When they nodded sadly, he took a deep breath and told them a story that broke their hearts into a million pieces. "After you boys left for London," Chief Peter began, "Mr. Joseph's life became very difficult. You see, he had given you everything. All his savings, all his possessions, everything he had worked for his entire life. We knew that." James said, tears already starting to form in his eyes. "But what you didn't know," the chief continued, "was what happened after you left. Mr. Joseph couldn't afford to pay rent on his rooms behind the school anymore. The little money he had left ran out after just 3 months. The villagers around them nodded sadly, remembering. "Where did he live?" John asked in a whisper. "He slept in the school building," Hannah replied, wiping her eyes. "On the floor of his old classroom. He had no bed, no proper food, no money for medicine when he got sick. Why didn't anyone help him?" James cried out, his voice breaking. "We tried," Chief Peter said. "We offered him food, a place to stay, money when we could spare it. But he refused everything. He said he had made his choice, and he was proud of it. He said as long as you boys were succeeding, his sacrifice was worth it." John fell to his knees in the dusty village square, overwhelmed by grief and guilt. "We should have sent him money. We should have called more often. We should have—" "Wait," Hannah said softly. "There's more you need to know." She disappeared into her small house and returned with a wooden box, old and worn, tied shut with a faded ribbon. "Mr. Joseph gave this to me before he died," she said, handing the box to James with shaking hands. He said, "If James and John ever come back, give them this. Tell them they were the greatest success of my life." With trembling fingers, James untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside were dozens of letters they had sent to Mr. Joseph over the years, along with photographs and newspaper clippings. But there was something else. A thick stack of papers covered in Mr. Joseph's careful handwriting. John picked up the first paper and began to read aloud, his voice shaking. "Year 1, month 3. I received a letter from James today. He is struggling with his classes, but he is not giving up. I am so proud. I may be hungry, but my heart is full. Year 2, month 7. John called today. The connection was bad, but I could hear the happiness in his voice. He is learning so much. Every day I sleep on the classroom floor is worth it to know they are succeeding. Year 4, month 12. I saw James's photograph in a newspaper someone left at the market. He has started his own business. I cried with joy. Who needs a comfortable bed when your students are conquering the world?" The papers went on and on, a detailed diary of Mr. Joseph's thoughts and feelings throughout the 10 years they were away. Every letter they had sent, every small success they had achieved, every milestone in their journey was carefully documented with the loving pride of a father watching his children grow. But the final entry was the one that destroyed them completely. Year 7, month 4. I am very sick now, and I know I don't have much time left. But I want James and John to know that they gave my life meaning. I was just a simple village teacher, but through them I was able to touch the world. If I died tomorrow, I'd die as the richest man who ever lived, rich in the knowledge that love and sacrifice can create miracles. Tell them that their teacher's last words were, "Thank you for making my dreams come true." James and John cried like they had never cried before. They cried for the man who had loved them more than his own comfort. They cried for the opportunities lost to thank him properly. They cried for the guilt of their success built on such sacrifice. But most of all, they cried because they finally understood what true wealth meant. "We failed him," James sobbed. "We became rich, but we forgot the most important thing. We have billions of dollars," John whispered, "but we couldn't save the one person who mattered most." The villagers watched with tears in their eyes as these two powerful men, who had conquered the business world, who had money and success beyond imagination, fell apart in the dust of their childhood village. But then, slowly, something else began to happen. As James and John read more of Mr. Joseph's diary entries, they began to understand something profound. Their teacher hadn't been waiting for them to repay him with money. He had already been repaid every day by their success, their growth, their achievements. He had lived his final years not in bitterness about his poverty, but in joy about their accomplishments. He had died not feeling forgotten, but feeling like the most successful teacher who had ever lived. That night, James and John sat under the same mango tree where Mr. Joseph had first promised to change their lives. They talked until sunrise, and by dawn, they had made a decision that would honor their teacher's memory in the most powerful way possible. "Money can't bring him back," James said, his voice hoarse from crying. "But we can make sure his sacrifice creates more miracles," John replied. Over the next few days, the two billionaires announced plans that shocked the entire nation. They would build not just one school, but 50 schools across the city, each one named the Joseph Mensa Academy of Excellence. They would create the Joseph Mensa Foundation with an initial donation of $100 million to provide free education, housing, and support for the poorest, brightest children in Africa. They would establish the Joseph Mensa Scholarship Program to send 1,000 African students to study abroad every year, completely free. But most importantly, they would move back to the city permanently and spend the rest of their lives doing what Mr. Joseph had done, identifying brilliant children from poor families and giving them opportunities to change their lives. 6 months later, the first Joseph Mensa Academy opened in Quamcrum, built exactly where the old village school had stood. It was the most beautiful, well-equipped school in the region, with modern classrooms, computers, a library, and dormitories for children who lived too far away to walk to school every day. At the opening ceremony, James and John stood before hundreds of villagers and students, no longer wearing expensive suits, but simple, local clothes. They had sold their mansion in London and moved back to their homeland permanently. "Our teacher, Mr. Joseph, taught us that success is not measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give away," James told the crowd. "He showed us that true wealth comes not from what you have in your bank account, but from what you have in your heart," John added. They unveiled a bronze statue of Mr. Joseph in the school's courtyard with an inscription that read, "To Mr. Joseph Mensa, a teacher who proved that the greatest investment you can make is in another person's dreams. Through his sacrifice, 2 boys became men. Through his legacy, thousands more will follow." As the years passed, the Joseph Mensa Foundation grew into one of Africa's most successful educational organizations. Thousands of children who had remained trapped in poverty were given opportunities to study, to dream, and to succeed. Many of these children, when they grew up and became successful themselves, returned to continue the work, creating an endless cycle of giving that rippled out across generations. James and John never became poor again, but they also never pursued wealth for its own sake again. They lived simply, worked tirelessly for others, and found a happiness deeper than any they had known during their years as billionaires in London. Every year on the anniversary of Mr. Joseph's death, James and John would sit under the old mango tree and read from his diary, reminding themselves of the lesson that had changed their understanding of everything. True success is not about how much you can accumulate for yourself, but about how much you can sacrifice for others. Real wealth is not measured in money, but in the lives you touch, the dreams you make possible, and the love you give away. The greatest return on investment comes not from what you put in the bank, but from what you put in another person's future. Mr. Joseph had died with nothing in his pockets, but everything in his heart. He had left behind no money, no possessions, no material legacy, but he had left behind something far more valuable. 2 men who understood that the purpose of success is not to elevate yourself, but to lift others up, and through them, he had left behind thousands of children who would grow up to lift up thousands more. That is the true meaning of wealth. That is the real definition of success. That is a legacy that lasts forever. Mr. Joseph never lived to see James and John return, but his sacrifice created something more valuable than money, a legacy of love that will continue for generations. His story reminds us that true success isn't about what we achieve for ourselves, but about what we make possible for others. Sometimes the greatest teachers are not found in the finest schools, but in the humblest hearts. Sometimes the richest people are not those with the most money, but those with the biggest dreams for others. And sometimes the most successful life is not the one that accumulates the most, but the one that gives away the most. What will your legacy be? How will you use your blessings to bless others? Moral lesson. True wealth and success come not from what you accumulate for yourself, but from what you sacrifice to lift others up. The greatest investment you can ever make is in another person's dreams, and the richest legacy you can leave is a life spent helping others succeed. Please like, share, and subscribe. And tell us where you are watching us from.